How did a desolate, flood-ravaged wasteland suddenly give birth to the towering metropolises of humanity's very first civilization? Imagine standing knee-deep in the fertile, sun-baked mud of the ancient Mesopotamian marshes. The warm air is thick with the scent of green reeds and impending rain. Early humans are slowly laying the very first mud bricks of human history. Before we quietly dive into the murky, fascinating waters of ancient Sumer, I would love to warmly welcome you to our growing community. If you enjoy our peaceful journeys together, please consider liking and subscribing. Let me know down in the welcoming comments. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you? Now, take a very deep breath, settle in, and get as comfortable as you possibly can. We gently prepare to uncover the grand dawn of our age. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we journey far back to the very cradle of human civilization. We flow seamlessly from the quiet, prehistoric marshes into the bustling, monumental streets of the world's first cities. The journey begins in the distant, ancient mud. The story begins in a truly harsh and unforgiving landscape. This was the ancient region of Sumer. It was located in the southernmost part of ancient Mesopotamia. Today, we know this vast land as modern-day Iraq, but thousands of years ago, it was a wild and untamed frontier. The flat land was dominated by the mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These massive waterways were not gentle or kind. They flooded unpredictably, bringing sudden destruction to the early pioneers. They were not at all like the reliable, seasonal flooding of the Egyptian Nile. The Mesopotamian waters were chaotic, wild, and deeply violent. Imagine the deafening roar of sudden, violent flash floods. The dark water rushed over cracked earth with terrifying speed. It was a true test of human endurance and spirit. And yet, the climate itself was incredibly hot and arid. The scorching, cloudless sky rarely offered any cool relief. The dry land received less than 10 inches of rainfall annually. The bright, heavy sun beat down relentlessly on the early people. You could easily smell the pungent, earthy scent of wet clay baking. The blinding sun quickly dried the soft mud into hard crusts. But human beings are endlessly, beautifully adaptable. The brave first settlers arrived around 5500 BC. They are known to us today as the ancient Ubaid people. They looked upon this difficult, dry land and saw great potential. They chose to stay. They chose to survive against all possible odds. Survival in this hot place required profound, brilliant ingenuity. The Ubaid people pioneered the first large-scale irrigation canals. They carved long, winding paths through the dry, baked earth. They bravely guided the chaotic river waters to their thirsty crops. This was no easy task for early humans. The soil in southern Mesopotamia lacked heavy, useful stone. There was no sturdy timber for building strong homes. There were no precious metal resources to be easily found. The land gave them absolutely nothing but mud and water. So, they used exactly what they had available to them. Soft clay and tall marsh reeds became the primary building materials. They built their entire vast world from the muddy riverbed. Feel the rough, organic texture of woven reed baskets. The people used these simple baskets to carry heavy mud from the riverbanks. They worked tirelessly from early sunrise to late sunset. The physical labor was immense and deeply exhausting for everyone. Swarms of tiny insects buzzed loudly over stagnant pools. These warm pools of trapped floodwater were absolutely everywhere. It was a humid, difficult, and highly dangerous environment, but their intense, generational hard work finally paid off. Soon, vibrant green strips of tall barley fields appeared. These lush, beautiful fields contrasted perfectly against the brown, lifeless desert. It was a stunning visual triumph over wild nature. They had miraculously brought brilliant life to the dust. But this was only the quiet beginning. The absolute necessity of maintaining these vast irrigation networks changed everything. Isolated, small villages could no longer survive entirely alone. They were forced to cooperate. They had to work tightly together to clear the long canals. They had to peacefully share the precious, life-giving water. This forced, daily cooperation laid the very groundwork for societal organization. They became a unified, structured, and highly capable people. This beautiful new unity brought unprecedented, wonderful abundance. Surplus agriculture changed human life forever. They finally grew far more food than they could ever eat. This abundance led directly to the first true division of labor in human history. Not everyone had to endlessly farm the land anymore. Some could become highly skilled potters. Some could peacefully weave fine garments in the shade. Fresh fish and wild waterfowl from the vast marshes formed a crucial part of their early diet. They ate very well, and their small communities rapidly thrived. The grand mastery over the chaotic rivers brought a massive surplus of food. This natural abundance fundamentally changed their shared human destiny. It naturally allowed these small, quiet farming communities to dream much bigger dreams. They began to build something entirely unprecedented and truly magnificent. They built the very first grand temples, and so the strong foundations of the civilized world were finally laid in the mud. The focus now gently shifts to a very special, holy place. This was the ancient and highly revered site of Eridu. The early Sumerians considered Eridu to be the first city ever created. It was the absolute, undeniable center of their ancient universe. Sumerian mythology states a beautiful and incredibly powerful belief. They believed that Eridu was the very first city given kingship directly from heaven. The high gods themselves chose this specific, muddy patch of earth. It was a sacred, holy ground, resting near the edge of the great waters. Eridu was proudly home to the primary cult center of Enki. Enki was the highly revered ancient god of water, creation, and deep wisdom. The grateful people believed he brought them the vital knowledge to survive. They owed their very lives to his deep, fresh, and flowing waters. The spiritual devotion of the people was absolute and entirely unwavering. The very first temple at Eridu was not grand or visually imposing. It was a simple, very small, mud brick shrine. It was lovingly and carefully built around 5000 BC, but it held immense, undeniable spiritual power. Step quietly inside the ancient doorway and feel the heavy atmosphere. The cool, shadowed interiors of the mud brick shrines offered sweet refuge. It was a quiet, peaceful escape from the blistering heat outside. The still air inside was thick with silent, heavy devotion. Over many long, slow millennia, these sacred temples slowly grew upward. They were continuously, carefully rebuilt on top of one another. Each passing, devoted generation added a new, higher layer of mud bricks. Slowly, they formed the massive, visually imposing early ziggurat. These massive stepped structures reached proudly for the high heavens, and with the rising temples came a new class of powerful leaders. The quiet priests were the original, trusted administrators of this early world. They carefully controlled the vital distribution of the vast agricultural surplus. They held the precious, life-saving keys to the grain. They spoke directly and confidently for the ancient, silent gods. The towering temples functioned as the true economic hubs of early settlements. They were the central, life-saving storehouses for the entire growing community. They safely kept the people fed during the harsh, dry times. Early religion, local economy, and basic daily survival were completely intertwined. The offering of fresh fish to the gods was a very common practice. This holy ritual took place daily at the great Eridu temple. You could easily smell the smoky, rich aroma of roasted fish offerings. The rich, earthy scent lingered heavily around the smooth clay altars. Look very closely at the ancient weathered altar structures. They featured dark, permanent burn marks from countless ancient sacrifices. The devoted people gave their absolute best to the water god Enki. Listen closely to the calming, gentle sounds of the warm evening. You can clearly hear the rhythmic, hypnotic chanting of early priests. Their deep, soothing voices echoed beautifully across the quiet, endless marshlands. It was a mesmerizing and deeply calming, repetitive sound. The grand sight of massive, multi-tiered temple platforms rising above flat reed huts was truly breathtaking. Smooth, perfectly polished surfaces of clay offering vessels sat perfectly at the god's feet. This deep, heavy devotion birthed a powerful, entirely new idea. The fundamental concept of the patron deity for each settlement originated in this exact era. Every growing, ambitious town desperately wanted their own divine protector. They wanted a powerful god to proudly call their own. But as deep time passed, the natural landscape began to slowly change. The mighty ancient city of Eridu eventually and slowly declined. The salty, deep Persian Gulf slowly receded over the long, quiet centuries. The deep waters pulled far away from the ancient city walls. This slow, unstoppable environmental shift completely changed the destiny of the city. It sadly left the once great coastal settlement stranded far inland. But its legendary, magical legacy was already firmly cemented in human history. Eridu was the divine, perfect blueprint for all future cities. As the grand temples of Eridu grew, so too did the local population. The massive, unprecedented concentration of human minds in one place sparked a revolution. It led directly to a spectacular, world-altering technological explosion. This brilliant spark of genius would forever change human history. We now gently enter the remarkable and deeply famous Uruk period. This was a breathtaking, exciting time of incredible technological leaps. Human ingenuity finally sparked like a brilliant, warm flame in the dark night. The rapidly growing population desperately needed much better ways to farm. So, the brilliant, early Sumerian minds invented the remarkable cedar plow. This single, highly clever invention drastically improved their vital crop yields. It dug the deep, earthy furrow and perfectly dropped the seed all at once. Early farming became much faster and incredibly, wonderfully efficient. But an even greater, far more legendary invention was slowly taking shape. The very earliest known wheels finally appeared in this ancient land. but they were initially used for pottery making, not for human transportation. The heavy, wet clay was expertly spun by human hands. The repetitive, deeply rhythmic spinning of the heavy clay potter's wheel changed absolutely everything. It was a mesmerizing, beautiful, circular dance of human creation. It allowed for the rapid, easy mass production of standardized clay bowls. They could easily create hundreds of them in a single, hot day. This seemingly simple spinning invention radically reshaped their entire growing economy. The humble, simple, bevel-rimmed bowl became a legendary historical artifact. It was the standard, universally accepted unit for distributing vital grain rations. Hard workers were paid daily using these exact, simple bowls. Imagine the staggering, breathtaking sight of thousands of identical, rough-edged bowls. They were stacked impossibly high in the sprawling, dusty temple courtyards. Every single tired worker reliably received their daily bread. It was a brilliant masterpiece of early human logistics and deep organization. Soon, the magical spinning wheel found an entirely new and revolutionary purpose. Heavy-wheeled carts for transport finally appeared in dusty Mesopotamia. This massive, world-changing leap forward happened around 3500 BC. The ancient world suddenly began to move much faster. Listen very closely to the deep, agonizing groan of thick wooden wheels. They turned very slowly and heavily on fully loaded, creaking carts. They carried massive, heavy stones and huge, golden piles of grain. Transporting vital, heavy goods across the dry earth was suddenly very possible. With better, much faster transport came incredible, entirely new, exotic materials. The sharp, metallic clang of early bronze tools began to loudly ring out. They struck sharply and efficiently against the hardened, baked earth. Bronze was a miraculous, incredibly durable new material for them. It was brilliantly created by cleverly alloying soft copper with rare tin, but precious, vital tin was not found anywhere in southern Sumer. This required dangerous, incredibly long-distance overland trade. The brave people had to boldly reach out to the vast, unknown world. They smartly looked to the flowing waterways for faster, much safer travel. Wooden sailboats were cleverly developed to navigate the deep, salty Persian Gulf. They also gracefully sailed the vast, winding, muddy river networks. The ancient rivers became the bustling, busy highways of the ancient world. Picture the beautiful, billowing white linen sails of wooden trading vessels. They bravely navigated the muddy, highly unpredictable rivers. They safely carried the heavy, incredible wealth of Sumer to distant, foreign lands. Vital trade networks expanded dramatically and incredibly quickly across the known world. They boldly reached far up into wild Anatolia and the distant Levant. They even bravely climbed the distant, rocky, dangerous Iranian plateau. Precious, highly exotic materials flowed steadily into the rapidly growing cities. Beautiful, vibrant blue lapis lazuli was imported from incredibly far away. It came from the high, snowy mountains of modern-day Afghanistan. It was a staggering, almost unbelievable logistical achievement for early humans. To perfectly manage this vast, unprecedented wealth, they needed strong, reliable security. So intricate cylinder seals were cleverly invented by clever city administrators. These small, beautifully carved stones were simply rolled onto soft, wet clay. They marked clear legal ownership and perfectly secured incredibly valuable trade goods. With unprecedented wealth and amazing technology flowing through the rivers, things rapidly changed. The scattered, small ancient settlements began to rapidly merge together. They grew incredibly large and unbelievably, overwhelmingly dense. This rapid, explosive, unstoppable growth culminated in something truly magnificent. It led directly to the birth of a true, staggering, urban leviathan. The grand age of the great city had finally, truly arrived. We have finally reached the true grand dawn of early civilization. This is the dramatic, awe-inspiring climax of our early ancient journey. The great city of Uruk rapidly expanded into a massive, sprawling metropolis. It was completely, entirely unlike anything the world had ever seen before. By 2900 BC, Uruk was a true global giant. It was the largest, most densely populated, and powerful city in the entire world. It bustled loudly, with over 50,000 permanent, busy residents. It was the undisputed, shining, majestic jewel of all ancient Mesopotamia. Uruk was a deeply, intensely religious, and incredibly powerfully built place. The massive, towering city was deeply dedicated to two major, powerful deities. The first was Anu, who was the supreme, all-seeing, ancient sky god. The second was Inanna, the highly fierce, beautiful goddess of love and war. They built spectacular, towering, massive homes for their beloved, highly powerful gods. The sacred inner precinct of Uruk was an absolute, undeniable architectural marvel. It featured massive, visually imposing limestone pillars proudly holding up the sky. These thick pillars were beautifully decorated with intricate, highly colorful clay cone mosaics. Imagine the vibrant, striking, perfect geometric patterns of these massive ancient walls. They used bright red, deep black, and stark white clay cones. These tiny, colored cones were pushed deeply into the wet mud plaster of the temple walls. They created a dazzling, deeply mesmerizing visual display for all to see. The massive city was also heavily and fiercely fortified against outside enemies. Uruk possessed a massive, highly intimidating, and truly legendary defensive wall. Ancient, whispered legends say it was built by the legendary king Gilgamesh himself. The imposing, heavy, shadowy bulk of the great city wall was truly terrifying. It loomed heavily and highly protectively over the surrounding, flat, dusty plains. The physical, sprawling scale of the city was truly hard to comprehend. It covered over 2 full, massive square miles of ancient earth. It was absolutely filled with densely packed, towering mud brick architecture. The chaotic, overwhelming, and constant noise of the city was absolutely everywhere. Tens of thousands of people lived closely in cramped, winding, dusty city alleys. Bustling markets buzzed constantly with eager, loudly shouting traders from distant lands. It was the vibrant, chaotic, unstoppable pulse of early human life. But this massive, incredibly complex, and dense society required strict, unyielding order. Social stratification quickly became incredibly rigid and deeply, harshly enforced. There was a very clear, sharp, undeniable divide among the early people. You had the highly powerful, incredibly wealthy elites sitting comfortably at the very top. You had the hard-working, tired commoners who endlessly worked the hot fields. And sadly, you had suffering, bound slaves trapped at the very bottom. The powerful, distant rulers tightly controlled absolutely everything in the massive city. The massive temple estates powerfully controlled vast, endless herds of noisy sheep. They created a highly centralized, incredibly profitable, and massive wool production industry. Listen closely to the endless, chaotic bleating of the massive, woolly flocks. Thousands upon thousands of sheep were herded daily toward the sprawling temple shearing sheds. Uruk was endlessly, desperately hungry for raw, highly valuable natural resources. The great city aggressively established far-flung, distant colonies in very remote regions. They desperately needed to secure vital, completely missing resources for their survival. They sought out strong, heavy timber and precious, highly shiny metal. Their vast, powerful influence smoothly spread out like a massive, invisible web. Uruk Isili established a powerful, completely undeniable cultural dominance over all others. This incredible, heavy influence deeply and permanently shaped the entire ancient Near East. They effectively and brilliantly created the very first true world system. But the absolute most striking sight was found right in the center. The absolutely great white temple of Uruk stood an incredible 40 feet high. It was beautifully and perfectly coated in bright, pristine, white gypsum plaster. The blinding, harsh glare of the high sun reflected brilliantly off the pristine temple. It could easily be seen for many, many miles across the flat desert. Uruk was a stunning, absolutely breathtaking marvel of early human achievement. But properly managing a massive, sprawling city of this staggering magnitude was incredibly difficult. It required something entirely new, brilliant, and completely unprecedented in history. They desperately needed a complex, highly accurate system to record the incredible wealth. This pressing, highly immediate administrative need completely changed the world. It led directly to humanity's absolute greatest, most profoundly important invention. The stage was finally perfectly set for the glorious birth of written words. The ancient mud was just about to learn how to beautifully speak. As we stand peacefully and quietly in the shadow of Uruk's great walls, I truly cannot help but wonder what other ancient, hidden mysteries deeply fascinate you. If there is a lost city or a forgotten, buried empire you would love for us to explore, please speak up. Whisper your creative, wonderful suggestions down in the warm, welcoming comments below. I always read every single one of them with great, genuine joy. Now, let us confidently step forward together into a whole new, exciting age. We gently and quietly enter a magical time where human history is finally written down. Sleep very well, my dear friends, and dream beautifully of the ancient dawn, while the devoted priests carefully recorded the vast wealth of the ancient temples. A profound change was slowly taking place. The towering cities of Sumer were growing incredibly large. They were bursting with new life, endless ambition, and staggering amounts of vital grain. But properly managing this massive, sprawling new civilization required something entirely unprecedented. Human memory was simply no longer enough to track the countless flocks of sheep and the endless bushels of harvested barley. The brilliant Sumerian mind needed a reliable way to perfectly freeze time and store precious information forever. This pressing, highly immediate need led directly to the very birth of written history. Writing was originally invented in the great city of Uruk, strictly as a simple accounting tool. It was absolutely not created for writing beautiful literature or sweeping, romantic poetry. It was born from the pure, absolute necessity of basic survival and complex administration. The early temple accountants desperately needed to know exactly who owned what. They needed to count the vast wealth of the gods. The earliest ancient texts were simply rough pictograms drawn carefully on wet clay. Scribes would walk down to the muddy riverbanks and gather handfuls of soft, dark earth. You can almost hear the soft, satisfying squelch of a wet clay tablet being molded in a scribe's hands. They would shape the wet mud into small, smooth, rectangular pillows. Then, using a sharply pointed river reed, they would draw simple, recognizable pictures. A crude drawing of a grain stalk meant barley. A simple drawing of a horned head meant a sheep. But over many long, quiet centuries, these simple pictures slowly began to change. Drawing curves in wet clay is incredibly difficult and very slow. The busy scribes needed a much faster, highly efficient way to write. They completely changed the shape of their simple writing tools. The stylus used for this new writing was made from a stiff river reed, cut cleanly with a sharp, triangular tip. Instead of drawing lines, the ancient scribes simply pressed the sharp, triangular tip deeply into the soft clay. This clever action left very sharp, precise indentations that looked exactly like tiny wedges. Over time, the recognizable pictures completely disappeared. They evolved fully into complex, beautiful wedge-shaped marks known today as cuneiform. You could see the intricate, mesmerizing geometric patterns formed by hundreds of tiny cuneiform wedges on a single tablet. This was a massive, world-changing leap forward for early humanity. Cuneiform eventually and beautifully evolved to represent actual phonetic sounds, not just physical objects. This meant that the actual, living spoken language could finally be perfectly recorded and preserved forever. The Sumerian language itself is a deeply fascinating, beautiful, historical mystery. It is a complete linguistic isolate, utterly unrelated to any other known human language family in the world. It stands entirely alone in the vast, complex history of human speech. Mastering this incredibly complex, difficult writing system was not an easy task for anyone. Young scribes underwent many long years of intense, highly rigorous daily training. They were sent away to specialized, highly disciplined, ancient scribal schools called the Ediba. The Ediba was the ancient house of tablets, a place of profound learning and strict order. Imagine the dusty, quiet atmosphere of a scribal school filled with long rows of young, practicing students. They sat quietly on the hard floor from dawn until dusk, endlessly copying ancient signs. You could easily smell the distinct, earthy scent of damp clay drying slowly under the hot Mesopotamian sun. Early accounting tablets meticulously recorded endless lists of sheep, vast stores of grain, and daily beer rations. But as the brilliant scribes completely mastered their complex craft, they began to write down much more. They began to record the beautiful, deeply human thoughts of their ancient people. The Instructions of Uruk is one of the absolute oldest known works of literature in the world. It is a beautiful, ancient text offering profound, timeless wisdom from a father to his beloved son. The ancient words miraculously survived the brutal, crushing weight of deep time. Most clay tablets were simply dried gently in the hot sun and stored away on wooden shelves. Only those precious tablets that were accidentally baked in massive, destructive city fires survived the long millennia. The raging flames of ancient destruction accidentally preserved the gentle voices of Sumer for us to hear today, while the quiet scribes peacefully recorded the wealth of the temples. A completely new kind of powerful leader began to emerge. They rose up slowly from beyond the towering temple walls, ready to fiercely claim that wealth through sheer force. As the many cities grew massively in size, their vital natural resources became increasingly scarce. Usable land and fresh water became the most precious, highly contested commodities in the ancient world. Desperate conflicts naturally erupted between the closely packed, highly ambitious city-states. The long, peaceful era of the quiet farmers was finally coming to a violent end. The narrative of human history explores a dramatic, profound shift in absolute power. For centuries, the high priest, known deeply as the En, had peacefully guided the faithful people. But the old priests could not easily protect the city walls from armed, invading neighbors. The frightened people desperately needed strong, capable warriors to physically defend their homes and their vast wealth. They turned to fierce, highly capable military commanders during times of great, terrifying crisis. This powerful new leader was called the Lugal, the ancient title. Lugal literally translates to big man in the complex Sumerian language. Early kings likely started simply as temporary elected military leaders, carefully chosen during times of immense danger. But once the terrifying crisis passed, these powerful men simply refused to give up their new authority. Kingship eventually became permanent and strictly hereditary. Fathers proudly passed their massive power down to their strong sons, establishing the very first dynastic bloodlines in history. The fierce Lugal did not live in the sacred temple with the quiet priests. He proudly resided in a massive, heavily fortified palace known as the Egal. This grand palace was physically, purposefully separated from the old, traditional temple complex. Imagine the massive, imposing cedar doors separating the royal, wealthy palace from the common, dusty city streets. A profound, deeply rooted tension constantly existed between the old, traditional priestly class and these new warrior kings. You could almost hear the tense, hushed whispers of temple priests nervously watching the king's vast power grow to perfectly secure their new, absolute rule. The ambitious kings cleverly sought divine approval. Kings confidently justified their harsh rule by claiming they were specifically, divinely chosen by the city's powerful patron god. They confidently claimed that the high heavens fully supported their mighty, unbreakable bronze swords. This incredibly powerful idea fundamentally changed human governance forever. The absolute concept of the divine right of kings has its deep, undeniable origins right here in this Sumerian era. The people fully believed that defying the fierce Lugal was exactly the same as defying the ancient gods themselves. The deeply fascinating Sumerian king list is an ancient, highly treasured document that records this dramatic shift. It is a beautiful, complex blend of mythical, magical stories and true, verifiable historical rulers. It lists ancient kings who allegedly ruled for tens of thousands of long years before the Great Flood. But remarkably, some of the mythical kings on the list were later proven to be real, flesh-and-blood historical figures. The legendary king in Mebrojesi was long thought to be a simple myth until his actual name was found carved on a real vase. These powerful, ancient kings took on massive, heavy responsibilities for their growing people. Kings became solely responsible for maintaining the massive city walls and eagerly commanding huge standing armies. Picture the heavy, highly intimidating footsteps of a king draped elegantly in thick, warm woolen cloaks. He proudly wears the gleaming, bright flash of a perfectly polished copper helmet under the glaring desert sun. Listen to the loud, highly rhythmic beating of heavy drums announcing the Lugal's grand procession through the busy streets. He was the absolute master of his vast, powerful domain. But with the rapid rise of these highly ambitious warrior kings, the scattered city-states were set on a dark path. They were placed on a violent, inevitable collision course, leading directly to the world's first documented military conflicts. The intense, incredibly bloody border conflicts between rival Sumerian city-states became a tragic, constant reality. The ancient landscape was deeply scarred by endless, brutal wars over precious resources. The most famous, widely studied conflict is the incredibly long-standing war between the powerful cities of Umma and Lagash. This bitter, generational feud was fought fiercely over a single, highly fertile strip of green land called the Jew Eden. Water was life, and the Gu Eden was rich with life-giving, flowing canals and lush barley fields. The desperate people of Umma and Lagash bled heavily into the dusty earth for many long, painful generations. The brutal, terrifying reality of ancient warfare is perfectly, chillingly captured in stone. The massive stele of the vultures is the absolute oldest known historical document detailing a violent border war. It was proudly erected by the victorious king Enatum of Lagash to permanently mark the new bloody border. King Enatum claimed a total crushing victory over the battered people of Umma. The heavy carved stone monument perfectly details the terrifying, highly organized nature of ancient Sumerian warfare. The stele vividly depicts a dense, deeply terrifying phalanx. They are shown marching coldly and methodically directly over the broken, fallen bodies of their defeated enemies. Sumerian soldiers were highly trained and fiercely disciplined in the dark, brutal art of early war. They carried incredibly long, sharp bronze spears and used very large, tightly interlocking rectangular leather shields. Picture the deafening, terrifying clash of bronze spears striking violently against heavy, leather-bound shields. These brave men fought shoulder to shoulder in the blinding, sweltering heat of the harsh desert sun. The intense battlefield was a place of utter chaos, loud screams, and absolute terror. Battle chariots drawn wildly by untamed wild asses, known as onagers, were highly favored for brutal shock tactics. These heavy wooden carts provided incredible, sweeping mobility across the flat, dusty plains. Imagine the choking, blinding clouds of thick yellow dust aggressively kicked up by charging heavy chariot wheels. The terrifying, completely chaotic braying of wild onagers pulling heavy war carts into battle was truly unforgettable. Wars were fought not just for the dusty land itself, but for absolute control of vital water rights and deep canals. The victorious king took absolutely everything from the losing side. Captured, defeated enemies faced a truly dark and horrific final fate. They were very often brutally sacrificed to the angry gods or enslaved forever for massive, back-breaking building projects. The religious aspect of ancient warfare was absolutely terrifying and entirely unyielding. The fierce god Ningasu was proudly depicted on the stone stele holding captured, suffering Amma soldiers tightly in a massive, inescapable net. He violently crushes their heads with a heavy, swinging mace, showing absolutely no divine mercy. Treaties between the warring cities were deeply, solemnly sworn by the names of the high gods. Breaking these sacred, binding treaties was universally considered the ultimate, unforgivable sacrilege. But the immense, staggering wealth secured securely through these brutal, endless conquests changed the cities. The massive spoils of war were eventually and fully funneled back into the grand capitals. This massive influx of stolen wealth resulted directly in breathtaking displays of absolute opulence that truly defied human imagination. The true, glittering climax of the early dynastic period is found in the deep, silent earth. We travel now to the legendary, incredibly wealthy southern city of ancient Ur. The breathtaking, deeply moving discoveries made here completely reshaped our modern understanding of the ancient world. The royal tombs of Ur were carefully and respectfully excavated in the 1920s by the brilliant British archaeologist Leonard Woolley. He dug deeply down through the thick layers of ancient mud and discovered an absolute, staggering treasure trove. He found the physical, glittering reality of the massive wealth held by the powerful Sumerian kings and queens. The most spectacular, unbelievably beautiful discovery was the deeply hidden tomb of Queen Pwabi. Her silent resting place was miraculously found completely intact, perfectly unlooted by greedy ancient grave robbers. For over 4,000 long years, she rested peacefully in absolute, undisturbed darkness. When Woolley finally opened her tomb, the brilliant, dazzling glint of ancient gold leaf shimmered beautifully in the dim light of his simple oil lamp. Queen Pwabi wore an incredibly elaborate, massive, and heavy headdress of pure, staggering wealth. It was painstakingly made of solid, bright gold leaves, deep lapis lazuli, and vibrant, blood-red carnelian beads. The deep, rich celestial blue of the perfectly polished lapis lazuli was imported entirely from distant, snowy mountains. It showed the massive, truly incredible reach of her vast royal power. Woolley also found the deeply famous, beautiful artifact known today as the Standard of Ur. This hollow wooden box features highly intricate, stunningly beautiful mosaic scenes of both brutal war and peaceful banquets. It was flawlessly created using tiny, perfect pieces of delicate shell, red limestone, and deep blue lapis. The ancient craftsmen of Ur were absolute, undeniable masters of their delicate, beautiful art, exquisite. Fragile musical instruments were also gently placed inside the dark, quiet tombs. A breathtaking, stunningly detailed gold and lapis bull-headed lyre was discovered resting silently near the queen. You can almost hear the delicate, profoundly sorrowful music of a wooden lyre echoing softly just before the heavy tomb is finally sealed. But the immense beauty of the royal tombs was accompanied directly by a deeply dark and horrifying reality. Right next to the beautiful queen, Woolley discovered what he grimly called the Great Death Pit. This massive, deeply disturbing pit contained the physical, skeletal bodies of 74 human attendants. These young men and beautiful women were purposefully sacrificed to serve the royals forever in the great afterlife. The haunting, entirely silent rows of skeletal attendants were laid out perfectly in neat, highly ordered lines. Archaeological evidence strongly suggests the loyal attendants willingly drank highly toxic poison from small, simple clay cups. They sat quietly in the dark pit, drank the poison, and simply waited for eternal sleep to take them. The loyal royal guards were buried fully armed with their heavy copper helmets and sharp weapons to protect the queen forever. The heavy, incredibly suffocating scent of ceremonial perfumes and damp earth must have filled the dark burial pit. This extreme, staggering wealth directly highlights the city of yore as a massive, bustling hub of international maritime trade. They controlled the vast, deep waters and gathered the absolute finest treasures of the known earth. But the brutal mass sacrifices show a deeply rooted, completely unshakable belief in a hierarchical, deeply physical afterlife for the Sumerian elite. They truly believed they could perfectly take their massive wealth, their beautiful music, and their loyal servants with them into eternity. The grand golden age of independent city-states successfully reached its absolute, glittering zenith in the mighty city of yore. But this massive, highly visible wealth had dangerously caught the greedy attention of a rising, fierce power from the harsh north. The beautiful, delicate music of the golden lyre was slowly fading, quietly signaling the sad end of a glorious era. The unbelievable, glittering treasures of yore show us exactly how much the ancient Sumerians deeply valued pure beauty, soothing music, and permanent legacy. Even while staring directly into the dark, unknown face of the afterlife, they absolutely demanded beautiful art. It makes one truly wonder what tiny, seemingly insignificant modern artifacts will actually survive deep time to tell our own human story. If you were to gently bury a small, simple time capsule tonight, what one single item would you carefully include to represent our current era? Please quietly share your wonderful, creative thoughts below in the welcoming comments. Let your busy mind drift peacefully as we slowly transition into the dark, quiet twilight of this truly great, ancient civilization. Sleep deeply and rest very well. The golden age of independent ancient kings eventually reached a beautiful, glittering peak. But no towering empire can possibly last forever under the hot, ancient sun. A massive, unavoidable change was slowly sweeping across the flat, dusty plains of ancient Mesopotamia. The long, vibrant era of independent, warring Sumerian cities was finally coming to a quiet end. A completely new, highly ambitious power was rapidly rising in the distant north. This vast, terrifying shadow was cast heavily by a man named Sargon of Akkad. Sargon was an incredibly brilliant, highly ruthless, and deeply ambitious military commander. He confidently marched his massive, highly trained armies south around 2334 BC. He brutally and systematically conquered every single independent Sumerian city in his path. The scattered, fiercely independent ancient cities were finally forcefully together under one banner. Sargon brilliantly and ruthlessly established the massive, unprecedented Akkadian Empire. This was the absolute first true multinational empire in all of recorded human history. He completely united the northern Akkadian speakers with the southern Sumerian speakers under his strict rule. But this forced unity brought a deep, profound, and permanent cultural shift. The powerful Akkadian language was completely Semitic in its ancient origins. It was entirely, fundamentally different from the unique, deeply isolated Sumerian language. To absolutely ensure his complete control, Sargon ordered a deeply symbolic, heartbreaking destruction. He purposefully and coldly tore down the massive, ancient defensive walls of the conquered Sumerian cities. He completely removed their ability to effectively hide or rebel against his supreme, unquestioned authority. Imagine the slow, crumbling, tragic descent of ancient mud brick walls. These beautiful walls had proudly protected the ancient people for many long, quiet centuries. Now they were violently torn down by harsh, conquering foreign armies. The heavy, completely resigned sigh of a Sumerian scribe could be heard in the dusty temples. They were now suddenly forced to learn and write in a completely foreign, harsh tongue. The unfamiliar, sharp syllables of the Akkadian language echoed loudly in the busy, crowded marketplaces. But the brilliant Akkadians did not completely destroy the beautiful Sumerian culture. They deeply admired it, gracefully absorbed it, and highly venerated the ancient gods. Sargon wisely installed his own beloved daughter as the supreme high priestess of Uruk. Her name was Enheduanna, and she is a truly beautiful, magnificent figure in deep history. She holds a profoundly special, incredibly rare place in the long story of humanity. Enheduanna is the absolute first-named, verifiable literary author in all of human history. She spent her quiet nights writing beautiful, sweeping religious hymns entirely in the traditional Sumerian language. Picture the quiet, solitary scratching of Enheduanna's sharp stylus composing elegant hymns. She sat peacefully alone in the silver, calming glow of the gentle temple moonlight. She deeply loved the ancient gods and praised them with brilliant, immortal words. The vast Akkadian Empire also brought a new, strict sense of highly organized order. They cleverly and strictly standardized all local weights and measures across the entire, massive conquered region. Trade became completely uniform, highly predictable, and incredibly efficient across the vast empire. But as the long decades slowly passed, a quiet linguistic death naturally occurred. The ancient, beautiful Sumerian language gradually and completely ceased to be spoken in the common streets. It slowly became a highly specialized, deeply sacred, liturgical, and scholarly tongue. It was preserved carefully by quiet priests, much like Latin was in much later eras. The smart Akkadians happily adopted the complex cuneiform script to perfectly write their own distinct language. They borrowed the ancient wedges to permanently record their own massive, sprawling history. But Sargon's incredibly powerful, sprawling empire eventually grew far too large and deeply unstable. A fierce, completely untamed mountain people, known simply as the Gukians, eventually invaded from the high peaks. Picture the dark, deeply ominous silhouette of wild mountain invaders descending upon the flat, peaceful plains. The heavy, chaotic Gutian invasion violently caused the total, devastating collapse of the great Akkadian Empire. A dark, deeply quiet age of brutal Gutian rule sadly fell over the ancient, weary cities, but this oppressive dark shadow eventually and inevitably passed into memory. The resilient, deeply ancient Sumerian spirit was not completely broken or entirely forgotten. It was simply resting quietly, preparing to rise up beautifully, one absolute final time. This beautiful, sweeping period is known today as the glorious Sumerian Renaissance. It was a magnificent, incredibly bright, but ultimately fleeting return to ancient glory. The brave, determined king, Yornamu, of Ur finally expelled the violent Gutians from the lands. He successfully and peacefully reunited the scattered Sumerian cities around 2112 BC. He proudly established the incredibly powerful, highly organized Third Dynasty of Ur. This era is deeply characterized by a sweeping, profound return to deep tradition and total peace. It was the absolute last great, blooming flowering of ancient Sumerian culture and beautiful art to proudly celebrate this return to order. King Ur-Nammu commissioned a true, undeniable architectural masterpiece. He ordered the massive, sprawling construction of the famous Great Ziggurat of Ur. This towering, massive stepped pyramid was deeply and lovingly dedicated to the benevolent moon god Nana. Imagine the colossal, beautiful, stepped shadow of the Great Ziggurat stretching perfectly across the peaceful evening city. It was a staggering, deeply impressive monument to divine power and human organization. The Ur-3 period is famously characterized by the most centralized, highly complex bureaucracy in the ancient world. The royal state peacefully controlled absolutely everything, from vast agricultural fields to tiny, remote weaving houses. Tens of thousands of beautifully preserved cuneiform tablets from this peaceful era have been carefully found. They deeply and precisely detail meticulous, incredibly complex state planning and daily human rations. Picture the endless, highly mesmerizing rows of meticulously organized clay tablets sitting safely in the royal archives. Every single loaf of bread and every single jar of beer was perfectly, carefully counted. King Ur-Nammu also beautifully gave his grateful people the gift of divine justice. He proudly promulgated the absolute oldest known surviving written law code in all of human history. This beautiful, fair law code predates the famous Code of Hammurabi by many long, quiet centuries. It was a remarkably gentle, highly civilized approach to human justice and peaceful resolution. The law code heavily utilized simple financial fines for offenses, rather than brutal, physical punishments. It completely rejected the harsh, violent eye for an eye principle of later, angrier empires. If a man was injured, he was peacefully and fairly compensated with precious silver. King Ur-Nammu was eventually succeeded by his highly capable, deeply ambitious son, King Shulgi. Shulgi proudly and boldly declared himself a true living god while he was still physically alive. He was a deeply passionate, highly generous patron of the complex scribal arts and beautiful music. To perfectly connect his sprawling, massive empire, Shulgi ordered a brilliant, highly effective new system. A vast, deeply interconnected network of smooth royal roads and safe rest houses was quickly established. This allowed vital, heavy trade and rapid royal messengers to move easily across the vast land. Listen to the quiet, steady, and fast footfalls of royal messengers running safely along the well-kept ancient roads. They carried urgent clay letters and vital news from one peaceful city to another. Beautiful literature and intricate arts deeply flourished during this long, golden time. The powerful royal state actively and generously sponsored the careful copying of ancient, beloved myths. You could easily hear the rhythmic, deeply calming chanting of temple singers praising the newly restored kings. Feel the smooth, perfectly fired ancient bricks bearing the proudly stamped name of King Ur-Nammu. This deeply peaceful period truly represents the ultimate, quiet zenith of traditional Sumerian administration. It was a beautifully ordered, perfectly balanced world, functioning in total, harmonious peace. Yet, despite the majestic, perfect order of the Ur dynasty, a silent tragedy was waiting. An invisible, completely unstoppable enemy was creeping slowly and quietly through the deep soil. It was silently threatening to completely destroy the very ancient foundation of their entire world. The fertile mud that had given them incredible life was slowly turning against them. This was the truly tragic, deeply heartbreaking, ecological collapse of ancient Sumer. The early Sumerians were absolute masters of deep canals and massive irrigation. But centuries of intense, constant irrigation, without proper, careful drainage, had caused a hidden disaster. The natural water table in southern Mesopotamia was incredibly high and deeply problematic. The intense, absolutely blistering evaporation rate of the harsh desert sun caused terrible, unseen damage. It slowly and constantly caused heavy, toxic salts to rise completely to the surface of the earth. Centuries of continuous, heavy river irrigation slowly trapped billions of microscopic salt crystals in the topsoil. The ancient, rich earth was becoming completely, irreparably poisoned by the very water that fed it. The deeply observant farmers quickly noticed their vital wheat crops were failing miserably. Wheat is highly sensitive to salty soil and simply refused to grow in the poisoned mud. The desperate transition from failing wheat to more salt-tolerant barley is heavily documented in ancient agricultural records. The farmers completely changed their planting habits simply to survive the changing, salty earth. But eventually, even the hardy, reliable barley crops began to sadly fail. The deep salinity levels eventually became completely and utterly toxic to absolutely all growing plants. The once lush, vibrant green fields slowly turned into barren, incredibly toxic brown wastelands. Crop yields in the deep southern cities dropped drastically by nearly 65% during this dark period. It was an absolute, terrifying agricultural disaster of epic, unprecedented proportions. Imagine the ghostly, shimmering white crust of toxic salt slowly suffocating the cracked, brown earth. You could clearly see the brilliant white salt crystals reflecting the harsh, unforgiving sun. The dying plants offered a truly heartbreaking, deeply sad visual reality. See the brittle, sadly yellowed stalks of dying barley whispering quietly in the dry, hot wind. Look at the slow, deeply melancholic trickle of a once mighty irrigation canal drying simply into mud. Massive, uncontrollable famine spread slowly but entirely, inevitably, across the great ancient southern cities. The lack of vital food severely weakened the vast economic power of the massive ancient temples. The people were incredibly hungry, deeply tired, and utterly, completely desperate for relief. This tragic, slow ecological disaster caused a massive, completely undeniable demographic shift. The starving population was slowly forced to sadly pack their entire lives and leave their ancient homes. They began moving slowly and steadily north, away from the salt, toward the rising city of Babylon. Heartbroken, defeated farmers permanently abandoned their deeply loved ancestral lands. Look closely into the hollow, incredibly tired eyes of desperate farmers walking away from their silent fields. They sadly left the elaborate ancient canal systems to simply dry, crack, and turn to dust. An oppressive, incredibly quiet stillness completely fell over villages, slowly losing their entire food supply. Without endless food to feed massive standing armies, the walls could not be defended. The deep agricultural collapse made the once mighty empire incredibly, dangerously vulnerable. They were suddenly totally exposed to brutal external pressures and fierce nomadic raids. Starving, deeply divided, and incredibly desperate, the weakened empire simply could no longer defend its borders. They unknowingly invited the absolute final, totally fatal blow that would extinguish ancient Sumer forever. The very end of the great Ur-3 dynasty is a deeply sad, incredibly tragic tale. Around 2004 BC, a massive, terrifying military coalition was fully formed against them. The fierce Elamites marched heavily from the mountainous east, seeking deep vengeance and massive wealth. The rugged Amorites pushed incredibly hard from the vast, dry western deserts. The desperate kings of yore had previously built a massive, sprawling defensive wall to stop the nomads. It was proudly called the Great Wall of the Amorites, designed to keep the wild world away. But the Great Wall completely and utterly failed to hold back the massive, starving human tide. The starving, weakened defenders could not physically hold the massive gates against the combined fierce enemy armies. The beautiful, ancient city of Ur was completely surrounded, heavily besieged, and brutally starved. The people inside suffered deeply, trapped behind their own high, useless defensive walls. Finally, the massive city was completely sacked, brutally destroyed, and entirely burned by the victorious Elamites. The beautiful, sacred temples were violently, completely stripped of their ancient, glittering wealth. King Ebisin was the absolute final, deeply tragic ruler of the great city of Ur. He was violently captured, completely humiliated, and led sadly away into a dark, foreign captivity. Imagine the heavy, deeply final clinking of thick bronze chains as the last king is led into exile. He walked slowly away from his burning home, destined to die completely alone in distant Elam. The massive, tinted destruction of your deeply shocked the absolute core of the ancient world. It was so profoundly traumatic that it inspired an entirely new, deeply sad genre of written literature. These beautiful, tragic clay poems are known simply as the City Laments, the deeply moving lament for Sumer, and Ur beautifully and tragically describes the end of their world. It describes the ancient, beloved gods sadly turning their faces away and completely abandoning their destroyed temples. They wept openly for the lost cities, the broken walls, and the scattered, deeply broken people. The poem vividly details the thick smoke of the burning city rising like a dark, heavy cloud. It hung ominously over the flat land, blocking out the light of the warm sun. Listen to the distant, deeply sorrowful weeping echoing endlessly through the smoldering, completely ruined streets of Ur. You can easily smell the thick, highly acrid scent of burning cedarwood rising from the destroyed temple roofs. The beautiful, intricate civilization of mud and reeds had finally, completely burned to the ground. Following the tragic, absolute fall of your immense political power permanently and entirely shifted north. The ancient southern cities completely lost their dominance to the rising empires of Babylon and distant Assyria. The Sumerians completely ceased to exist as a distinct, independent, political or ethnic entity. They simply faded very quietly and entirely peacefully into the vast, complicated tapestry of later history. Their magnificent, towering cities were entirely abandoned to the harsh, blowing desert winds, without constant human hands to carefully repair the soft mud bricks. The cities simply melted away. See the slow, completely inevitable shifting of dry desert sand, permanently burying the beautifully paved courtyards. The grand ziggurats slowly eroded back into soft, formless mounds of simple brown clay. The quiet, incredibly tragic poetry of the beautiful laments was etched deeply into the baked clay. These sad words perfectly preserved a massive civilization's absolute final, dying breath. And so, the truly great ancient cities peacefully returned to the simple mud from which they were first born. Their truly epic, massive human story was buried deeply beneath the shifting dunes. They rested there, waiting completely, silently, and incredibly patiently for many long millennia to pass. And with the final, quiet fall of yore, the vibrant, chaotic, and brilliant story of the Sumerians gently fades. It slowly, completely fades into the warm, quiet, and deeply peaceful embrace of the desert sands. The ancient rivers simply continued to flow exactly as they always had. New, entirely different empires proudly rose in the distant north, completely forgetting the ancient past. But the very first great, brilliant architects of human civilization were finally laid to a peaceful rest. Thank you so much for walking so closely alongside me through the rise and fall of this magnificent era. If you have found yourself deeply, happily lost in the ancient, quiet marshes with me tonight, please do reach out. Please gently leave a kind like and beautifully subscribe to the Sleeping Scribe channel. This simple action ensures we can peacefully embark on many more wonderful historical journeys together. As the fine ancient dust finally settles perfectly over the vast plains of ancient Mesopotamia, let your body relax. Let your deep, slow breathing truly slow down, and let your busy mind peacefully drift. We will softly, gently explore the beautifully enduring, quiet echoes they left softly behind. Sleep very deeply now, completely surrounded by the quiet, ancient history of our fascinating world. The grand, magnificent story of the ancient Sumerians slowly came to a quiet, inevitable end. Their massive, towering cities were entirely abandoned to the harsh, blowing desert winds. The people themselves peacefully melted away into the vast, complicated tapestry of later history. And then, a truly profound and incredibly long silence fell heavily over the land. For nearly 4,000 long, quiet years, the very name of Sumer was completely and utterly erased from human memory. It is a deeply humbling, almost terrifying thought to consider how easily an entire, massive civilization can simply be forgotten. They were the brilliant, tragic pioneers who took the very first, heavy steps out of the dark, prehistoric world. Yet, the great, powerful empires that proudly followed them knew absolutely nothing of their ancient, foundational existence. Even the highly educated, deeply curious ancient Greeks and the powerful, far-reaching Romans had no knowledge of the Sumerians. The brilliant Greek philosophers walked the earth, completely unaware of the ancient clay tablets resting quietly beneath the eastern sands. The grand, mighty Roman legions marched confidently across the known world, completely blind to the true, deep origins of human civilization. The heavy, dusty pages of the Holy Bible briefly mentioned incredibly ancient, mysterious cities like Ur of the Chaldees and the great city of Uruk, but their true, ancient origins and the fascinating, complex people who originally built them remained a complete, impenetrable mystery. The physical, ancient world of Sumer was simply swallowed whole by the slow, unstoppable passage of deep time. Ancient mud brick architecture is highly, tragically susceptible to the slow, inevitable forces of harsh wind and heavy winter rain. Without the constant, dedicated care of human hands to press fresh clay into the crumbling walls, the great cities simply dissolved. The massive, towering ziggurats softly lost their sharp, precise geometric edges as the centuries slowly passed. They melted very slowly and quietly back into the damp earth from which they were so proudly and painstakingly built. Over many long, quiet centuries, these collapsed. Entirely ruined cities formed massive, completely artificial hills across the flat desert landscape. These strangely shaped, unnatural mounds of earth are known today in the Arabic language simply as tells. Imagine the soft, endless whispering of dry desert winds sweeping peacefully over these formless hills of dust. You could easily walk directly over a buried ancient metropolis without ever knowing the incredible secrets hidden beneath your feet. Nomadic Bedouin tribes often set up their warm, quiet evening camps directly near these massive, strange tells. They rested their tired flocks and drank warm tea, completely without realizing what immense history lay resting quietly beneath their warm campfires. The deep, calming silence of the starry desert night settled peacefully over the deeply buried, forgotten cities. The harsh, incredibly unforgiving environment of southern Iraq naturally deterred early European exploration for many long centuries. The blistering summer heat, the dangerous, muddy marshes, and the vast, trackless deserts kept the ancient secrets perfectly safe and deeply hidden. The gentle, gradual accumulation of fine desert sand slowly and peacefully buried the absolute last exposed baked bricks. But deep down in the dark, quiet earth, a profound, beautiful miracle of preservation was silently taking place. The forgotten, discarded clay tablets lay perfectly, wonderfully preserved in the dry, oxygen-poor earth of the deep tells. While the fragile papyrus of Egypt eventually rotted away, the simple baked mud of Sumer happily endured the crushing weight of time. The quiet, completely undisturbed slumber of millions of silent clay tablets rested safely beneath the warm earth. The proud memory of later, violent empires like Babylon and mighty Nineveh managed to successfully survive in human myth and biblical legend, but their deeply ancient, peaceful Sumerian predecessors simply vanished into the quiet, dark fog of prehistoric myth. Only the silent, heavily eroded, and wind-battered peaks of the absolute largest ancient ziggurats gently hinted at the massive ruins below. The warm, beautiful golden hue of the evening sunset cast long, peaceful shadows over the empty, quiet plains. They slept in complete, beautiful silence for thousands of long years. They waited patiently until the deeply curious minds of the modern era began to finally dig into the vast mysteries of the ancient East. The long, quiet centuries slowly rolled over the buried cities until the world finally reached the middle of the 19th century. This was a truly fascinating, deeply romantic era of grand European diplomats, brave early explorers, and the very birth of modern archaeology. In the mid-1800s, adventurous explorers like Austin Henry Layard began eagerly excavating the dusty mounds in distant Mesopotamia. They traveled with massive, well-funded expeditions seeking the lost, legendary cities mentioned in the ancient biblical texts. Their initial, highly publicized excavations focused primarily on the massive northern Assyrian sites, like the deeply feared city of Nineveh. They quickly found the terrifying giant stone bulls and the fierce, highly detailed war reliefs of the powerful Assyrian kings. But as these brave, deeply curious explorers slowly pushed further south into the harsh, marshy plains, things began to quietly change. They began to gently unearth bizarre, entirely unknown artifacts that looked completely different from the northern Assyrian finds. Explorers began slowly finding heavily baked clay tablets deeply buried in the southern tells. These strange, tiny tablets were entirely written in an incredibly complex, unknown, and totally non-Semitic language. The strange wedges did not match anything the brilliant linguistic scholars of Europe had ever seen before. The monumental, world-changing breakthrough finally came with a dedicated French diplomat named Ernest de Sarzec. He proudly served as a diplomatic vice-consul and held a deep, profound passion for ancient, buried history. In the year 1877, he boldly began to deeply excavate a massive, dusty southern mound, known simply as Tello. Tello was actually the ruins of the deeply ancient, highly sacred Sumerian city of Gersu. As his hired men dug slowly down into the baked earth, they uncovered something truly breathtaking and completely unexpected. Imagine the gentle, deeply rhythmic scraping of a metal trowel against the dry, heavily compacted earth. Picture the soft, careful brushing away of fine sand to finally reveal the smooth, perfectly dark stone of a forgotten statue. Ernest de Sarzec had beautifully discovered the magnificent, masterfully carved diorite statues of the ancient, peaceful king Gudea. These massive, silent stone statues revealed an entirely new, incredibly unique artistic style to the completely stunned modern world. The smooth faces of the statues belonged to an entirely unknown, deeply ancient, and highly advanced people. They wore strange, woven woolen kilts and held their hands tightly clasped in quiet, eternal religious devotion. The brilliant, highly respected German-French scholar Julius Oppert carefully studied these strange, newly discovered artifacts and the alien writing upon them. He was the absolute first modern human to boldly and correctly propose the ancient name Sumerian for this magnificent, completely forgotten civilization. He logically deduced that this ancient, isolated people must have directly preceded the powerful Akkadians and the later Babylonians. It is important to remember that these incredibly early 19th century excavations were often very rough and highly unscientific. They honestly resembled massive, chaotic treasure hunts, far more than the slow, highly careful, and meticulous modern archaeology we know today. Men dug deep, dangerous trenches quickly, looking desperately for massive stone statues and highly valuable golden museum pieces. Thousands upon thousands of heavily inscribed, dusty clay tablets were hastily gathered from the deep, dark trenches. They were quickly and carefully packed into heavy wooden crates to protect their fragile, ancient edges. These massive, heavy crates were then shipped on long, slow boats back to the grand, echoing museums in London, Paris, and Berlin. Imagine the quiet, collective gasps of absolute awe in the dimly lit, quiet museum halls as these ancient artifacts were finally unpacked. The warm, softly flickering light of a quiet kerosene lamp softly illuminated the newly discovered, deeply alien trenches. The sheer, unbelievable volume of newly unearthed texts completely and utterly overwhelmed the very small, dedicated community of European linguistic scholars. They simply had absolutely no idea what they had just found buried in the southern mud. Feel the profound, deeply moving feeling of cool, ancient clay touching a warm human hand for the absolute first time in millennia. The slow, heavy realization finally dawned on the brilliant scholars of the modern world. They had not just found another lost, ancient biblical city hidden in the dust. They had actually, miraculously, found the true, undeniable cradle of all human civilization. But simply having the silent clay tablets sitting quietly on a museum shelf was only the very first, incredibly small step. The true, profound magic lay entirely in finding a way to make the silent clay beautifully speak once again. The painstaking, incredibly brilliant, and deeply slow decipherment of the complex cuneiform script is a monumental triumph of the human mind. It is a deeply beautiful, highly intellectual story of immense, unwavering patience and profound scholarly dedication. The massive, deeply confusing puzzle of cuneiform initially seemed completely impossible to solve by modern linguistic experts. It was a completely dead, forgotten writing system used to write a completely isolated, deeply unknown ancient language. The vital, absolute key to finally unlocking this deep mystery was found high up on a dangerous, rocky cliff face. A brave, deeply dedicated British Army officer named Henry Rawlinson achieved something truly magnificent and highly dangerous. He carefully and bravely copied the massive ancient Behistun inscription, which was carved high on a sheer rock cliff in distant Iran. He reportedly dangled dangerously from thick ropes over a massive, terrifying drop just to accurately copy the tiny, intricate wedges. The Behistun inscription perfectly served as the vital, deeply necessary Rosetta Stone for all cuneiform decipherment. It was a massive, proudly carved royal decree written beautifully in 3 entirely different ancient languages. It was written perfectly in Old Persian, the Elamite language, and the complex Babylonian Akkadian language. The brilliant, highly educated scholars back in the quiet libraries of Europe first successfully deciphered the Old Persian text. Old Persian was much closer to known, modern languages, providing a solid, deeply necessary linguistic foothold. Once they could perfectly read the Old Persian, it brilliantly and smoothly unlocked the difficult, Semitic, Akkadian translation right beside it. Understanding the Akkadian language finally allowed the dedicated scholars to tackle the much older, completely isolated Sumerian language. They slowly realized that cuneiform was not a simple, basic alphabet like the ones we use so easily today. The brilliant decipherment process proved that cuneiform was an incredibly complex, highly mixed system. It was a fascinating, dense mix of whole-word logograms and thousands of distinct, individual phonetic syllables. It was like trying to slowly solve a massive, multi-layered mathematical puzzle with missing, broken pieces. Brilliant, deeply patient men, like the Irish clergyman Edward Hincks and the scholar Jules Oppert, were absolutely instrumental. They spent their entire quiet lives making the absolute final, deeply necessary translation breakthroughs. Imagine the quiet, peaceful rustle of old, yellowed paper in a highly quiet, deeply dusty 19th century university library. Picture the intense, heavily focused gaze of a lonely scholar examining tiny, microscopic wedges through a thick glass magnifying lens. To finally prove to the skeptical modern world that they could actually read the ancient, dead wedges, a grand test was devised. The highly respected Royal Asiatic Society in London held a deeply famous, strictly controlled translation test in the year 1857. They confidently gave 4 different, highly respected scholars a completely sealed, newly discovered ancient clay text. They asked all 4 brilliant men to independently and quietly translate the ancient text without speaking to one another. When the 4 sealed envelopes were finally opened, the 4 distinct translations were incredibly, undeniably similar. The quiet, academic world had finally, definitively proven that ancient cuneiform could be reliably and accurately read. Deciphering the deeply ancient Sumerian language revealed something incredibly beautiful and highly helpful. It revealed intricate, massive, bilingual dictionaries that were carefully created by ancient Akkadian scribes long ago. The Akkadians themselves had desperately needed thick, heavy dictionaries to properly learn the dying Sumerian language. The slow, meticulous process took many long decades of deeply patient, highly meticulous comparison of tiny, almost invisible wedge marks. Listen to the slow, incredibly satisfying scratch of a heavy fountain pen translating ancient alien symbols into modern flowing English. Hear the deeply peaceful, rhythmic ticking of a grand clock in a warm study as centuries of deep linguistic mysteries are gently unraveled. Feel the profound, highly emotional realization of finally hearing an ancient, deeply forgotten human voice speak directly from the cold clay. Reading the vast, endless sea of ancient texts completely transformed the Sumerians in our modern eyes. They were completely changed from a vague, deeply mythical prehistoric people into a profoundly real, deeply human, and highly emotional historical reality. And when the dedicated scholars finally learned to properly read the ancient clay, they uncovered a massive treasure. They found the absolute oldest, most deeply profound story ever written down by human hands. In the quiet, dusty back rooms of the massive British Museum, a truly monumental literary discovery was quietly waiting to happen. In the year 1872, a deeply brilliant, entirely self-taught Assyriologist named George Smith was translating broken clay tablets. He was slowly, methodically, reading through a massive, dusty pile of broken fragments brought back from the Grand Library of Nineveh. Suddenly, his eyes fell upon a specific, heavily damaged clay tablet that made his heart race. He had famously and miraculously discovered what is known today as the legendary Flood Tablet. When he finally realized exactly what he was reading, the deep, profound emotion was absolutely overwhelming. The ancient, broken clay was telling a deeply familiar, highly dramatic story of a massive, world-destroying flood. The deeply moving Epic of Gilgamesh is universally recognized today as the absolute oldest, surviving work of truly great human literature. It beautifully and tragically tells the sweeping story of the real, historical king Gilgamesh of ancient Uruk. Over the long, quiet centuries, the real king was heavily mythologized into a massively powerful, deeply flawed ancient demigod. The story deeply and beautifully explores the profound, life-changing friendship between the proud king Gilgamesh and the wild, untamed man Enkidu. They fight terrible, ancient monsters together in the dark, deeply fragrant, and deeply ancient cedar forest. But the ancient gods are deeply cruel, and they tragically decree that the beloved wild man Enkidu must sadly die. Following Enkidu's deeply tragic, highly emotional death, Gilgamesh is completely and utterly broken by profound, heavy human grief. He suddenly realizes his own fragile, highly vulnerable mortality and becomes completely terrified of the dark, silent underworld. Gilgamesh bravely embarks on a massive, completely desperate, and entirely doomed human quest to find eternal, physical immortality. He desperately seeks out the ancient, legendary man named Utnapishtim, who miraculously survived the Great Flood. The epic contains a massive, deeply detailed flood narrative that is remarkably and incredibly similar to the much later biblical story of Noah. It speaks of a massive boat, the gathering of innocent animals, and the release of tiny birds to find dry, safe land. The discovery of this specific ancient flood tablet caused a massive, highly emotional sensation in proper, deeply religious Victorian society. It proved that the ancient, fundamental stories of humanity were far older than anyone had ever previously imagined. The story eventually concludes with a deeply profound, beautifully quiet, and highly peaceful realization by the tired king. Gilgamesh finally realizes that true, lasting immortality does not lie in living forever in a fragile, physical body. True immortality lies only in the beautiful, lasting legacy of one's great deeds and the strong, protective walls one builds for others. The massive, sweeping poem was originally written as a loose, completely disjointed collection of simple, independent Sumerian poems. These quiet, ancient poems were later beautifully unified and highly polished into a single, massive epic by later Akkadian writers. Imagine the soft, deeply dramatic reading of the epic's ancient lines echoing smoothly in a quiet, warmly wood-paneled university lecture hall. Picture the gentle, deeply tragic realization of human mortality finally settling peacefully over the proud, exhausted king of Uruk. Visualize the dark, heavy imagery of the deeply ancient, highly fragrant cedar forest where the brave heroes battled terrible monsters. Feel the deeply calm, absolutely quiet acceptance of fate as Gilgamesh finally admires the sturdy, deeply baked walls of his beloved city. The beautiful, incredibly timeless, and deeply resonant echo of profound human sorrow smoothly traverses across 5,000 long years. The emotional depth of Gilgamesh beautifully and perfectly proves something deeply comforting to our modern minds. It proves that the ancient, distant Sumerians grappled daily with the exact same deep, existential fears and profound hopes that we do today. They loved deeply, they grieved heavily, and they desperately sought deep meaning in a highly chaotic, highly unpredictable world. The beautiful stories of ancient Sumer deeply nourish our modern weary souls with their profound ancient wisdom, but their absolute most pervasive, completely undeniable, and deeply hidden legacy is quietly woven into the very fabric of our reality. It is quietly and perfectly woven into exactly how we carefully measure our fleeting, precious lives today. We turn now to the quiet, highly logical, and deeply brilliant world of ancient Sumerian mathematics. The enduring, incredibly practical legacy of Sumerian math is perhaps their most absolute, undeniable contribution to our modern world. Highly functional numeral system that is completely based entirely on the number 60. This fascinating, deeply unique mathematical approach is known today by scholars as the complex sexagesimal numeral system. It was born directly from their deep, highly careful lunar observations and their brilliant understanding of early, highly precise geometry. The Sumerians did not simply pick the number 60 entirely at random from the ancient, dusty air. The number 60 was beautifully and deliberately chosen precisely because it is an incredibly, highly composite number. This means it is highly, beautifully, and easily divisible by many smaller, highly useful whole numbers. You can easily, perfectly divide 60 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This incredible high level of easy divisibility allowed the ancient, brilliant astronomers to make incredibly precise, deeply complex astronomical calculations. They could perfectly map the slow, majestic movements of the ancient stars without ever needing to use deeply confusing, complex fractions. Their deeply brilliant, highly logical mathematical system was incredibly, vastly superior to many systems that followed it. It is a truly breathtaking, deeply profound realization to know that they still dictate our modern lives. The precise, perfectly measured 60-second minute and the 60-minute hour are absolute, direct descendants of this brilliant Sumerian invention. Every single time you look quickly at your digital watch or your ticking wall clock, you are seeing the perfect, geometric, 360 degrees in a modern circle also originated directly from ancient Sumerian geometry. It closely mirrored their highly precise, carefully observed, approximate 360-day agricultural solar calendar. The familiar, deeply ancient 12 astrological signs of the massive zodiac were also firmly established using this exact mathematical foundation. Later, deeply observant Mesopotamian astronomers simply built their complex star charts directly upon the solid, baked clay foundations of early Sumer. Sumerian mathematics was not just simple, basic counting of their vast, noisy herds of sheep. Their highly complex mathematical tablets clearly included complex multiplication tables, advanced fractions, and even the calculation of precise square roots. Their deep mathematical knowledge was beautifully and peacefully passed down directly to the later, highly ambitious Babylonians. The Babylonians then carefully and perfectly passed it directly to the brilliant, highly curious ancient Greeks, and the ancient Greeks passed it safely and securely directly down to us in the modern, highly digital world. Every single time we carefully measure a sharp angle to build a house, we are completely utilizing their ancient technology. Every time we watch the quiet, rhythmic ticking of a modern clock, we are utilizing a technology invented in ancient Uruk. It is a deeply beautiful, incredibly quiet, and entirely invisible golden thread connecting us to them. This deep mathematical thread intimately and perfectly connects our massive, highly digital modern world directly to the ancient, wet clay. Listen very closely to the gentle, highly rhythmic, deeply comforting ticking of a modern clock measuring out ancient Sumerian seconds. Picture the incredibly precise, highly careful alignment of an ancient, quiet astronomer observing the slow, majestic movement of the silver moon. Visualize the incredibly neat, highly ordered rows of cuneiform numbers pressed deeply and perfectly into a small mathematical exercise tablet. Feel the quiet, completely endless, deeply peaceful spinning of the massive earth, measured strictly in degrees, first carved into wet clay. There is a profound, deeply comforting feeling of a massive, beautifully shared human continuity spanning across all of recorded human time. We are completely, entirely, and deeply connected to the people who first walked out of the ancient, muddy marshes. The beautiful, profound legacy of Sumer quietly surrounds us every single day, completely unseen, but highly, beautifully functional. But to truly understand them, to really feel their deep, ancient presence, we must step entirely away from academic history. We must simply close our tired eyes and breathe the warm, heavy air of their ancient world one absolute last time. As we quietly and slowly close the heavy, dusty book on the grand, sweeping arc of their incredible history, we see the absolute truth. We beautifully and clearly see that the ancient, brilliant Sumerians never truly, completely vanished from our world. They happily and permanently live on in the quiet, steady ticking of our modern digital watches. They perfectly live on in the precise geometric degrees of our massive, highly detailed modern world maps. And they live beautifully on in the eternal, deeply human search for profound meaning found in the poetic lines of Gilgamesh. They were the brilliant, deeply tragic, highly creative pioneers who bravely took the absolute first, heavy steps out of the prehistoric dark. They built the massive, towering ziggurats. They invented the rolling wheel, and they taught the very mud how to beautifully speak. Let these deep, scholarly reflections settle very quietly and peacefully in your tired, resting mind tonight. Take a very deep, incredibly slow, and highly relaxing breath of the cool, quiet night air. If you are still peacefully awake and wish to drift even deeper into the warm, comforting dark, join me now. Join me as we gently leave the heavy, dusty textbooks far behind us. We will now take a slow, deeply peaceful, and highly immersive walk through a single, quiet day in the beautiful life of an ancient Sumerian city. Sleep very deeply, sleep very well, and dream beautifully of the ancient, echoing clay.